Here we are in Chapter 4. We have returned to Derceto after being away in the other worlds for a while. The sun has set and the weather is getting worse. We just learned that Baptiste and Lottie are back in the house, and we put a little bit of suspicion on them, because this chapter is about getting the player to first become a little paranoid, but ultimately feel like their character has almost lost their mind.
After coming back to the Derceto, we have this night mood going, and besides the blue moonlight, we have used the green light, the green artificial light, as an amplifier to increase the amount of horror or nightmare mood, sort of.
As we were opening up more of Derceto in Chapter 4, it felt necessary to close something off, to avoid having the player roam around unnecessarily in places where nothing was meant to happen. But to let the player have one final look, we lead them through the dining hall and the library, but most importantly the conservatory. If you have finished the game, you already know that this is the most important room in the house. This is where, early on in Chapter 1, we first show you the tree, which turns out to be the final boss in Chapter 5. Even though the player doesn't know the tree is the big baddie yet, it felt important to remind the player about it, that it simply existed. That's why we take this little lap before we get into the proper play area of Chapter 4.
Another huge difference is that even if I used to say that the house in the original game was a kind of character in the game, actually it was more just Jeremy Hartwood's house. But now there is really more connection between the character and the house.
We certainly had a little bit more freedom to make Derceto bigger and sort of mean more, I suppose. But yeah, I wouldn't immediately say one decision is better than the other. I think it was a powerful experience to just rummage through Jeremy Hartwood's house in the original.
Mr. Waits must have had a spare key to Dr. Gray's office, but where?
For me, the original game was more an adventure game than a fight game, a kind of a try to bring the point-and-click spirit into 3D.
As I was naming the things in our story that wasn't at the very center, but rather that I needed another doctor for Dr. Gray to be corresponding with, for instance, I tried to pick things found in the original game that seemed to have an essence of the thing I was naming. But as I was doing this, I realized that the original names had something peculiar to them. The names sometimes correlated with names of the developers themselves. So for instance, in the name Tarouea, it was a take on Jean-Marc Toroea, who was one of the 2D artists for the original game. Or for instance, the text named The Book of Yael, written by Monsignor Bachet, both fits the first name of Yael Barros, another 2D artist, and also Philippe Bachet, the composer. You might think this would provoke me to start pulling names out of our own team, but I instead decided to double down on the original team. Since this is a love letter to the original, I didn't want to focus on our team, but rather the ones who came before. I always split the names, of course. I don't want anyone to think I was referencing the actual person. I don't know any of them, so yeah. The only person from the original game that is mysteriously but actually addressed in our game is Frederick Renault. While all our characters are quite mysterious in their own right, Cassandra Beauregard might take the cake. She is our narrator, but she also appears to have died before we even arrived to Derceto. She is writing about our characters like it's one of her novels. I won't reveal too much, I don't want to ruin the fun of overthinking this kind of stuff, but her texts I enjoy the most are the clearly unreliable endings to her writing that you can hear in chapter 5.
Fun fact about this bathroom is that we referenced very heavily the design aesthetics from the film The Shining. Both the colors and the yellow rounded border is taken directly from the film. For the Maccabean nightclub, we wanted this over-the-top Art Deco vibe going, and we went with a lot of gold and purple curtains, and we have also this very nice glass wall behind the bar, which would create a lot of nice lighting effects from the ceiling light.
A character that was fun to write for was Dr. Gray. He was certainly off-putting, but we don't really get a good sense of how bad of a person he was. I don't imagine a lot of people liking him, but that doesn't necessarily make him a bad person. I personally think he behaved quite poorly at times because he was a smart man, often surrounded by not so smart people, which made him arrogant and quite annoying. But he did seem to want to help people, and he never really got caught up in the whole cult business. His fall was really brought on by a lack of control and inability to sway the cultists not to call on the Black Goat in the end. All in all, I wanted to write a character that the player thinks, he can't be the bad guy, right? It would be too obvious. But maybe?
The attic in the original game is not only the first room that the player visits, it's also a room the dev team spent a lot of time in it because it was the first room we worked on, and actually it's kind of abstract of the whole game. You can find a lot of principles of the game in it. You can push items, you can find books, you can find weapons, and it's actually a lot of way of working in the game exists in the attic.
A good example about problems we need to solve when we create game worlds like this is the attic, where we need to sell the idea that we have this large roof we need to support, but we also wanted to use the supporting beams as something that would cast expressive and kind of these thick, long shadows from the moonlit window. For the steamboat, we really used the overgrowth theme well, I think. You can almost feel how the overgrowth is taking over the ship, and it's just spreading like crazy. To add discomfort and tension to the player, we let the chip have a very strong tilt going. And this is actually something we have used throughout the game to play with the perspective and just add this general discomfort.
Maybe the older players may recognize the music which is playing, which is Danse Macabre, which won the right record to choose in the original game to make the ghost move.
How long have I been here?
Chapter 4 is all about making the player question the sanity of our hero. The story has the hero focused on breaking a very vague contract that hinges on these 3 steps, which to the player is fairly clear that it is just a treatment plan written by Dr. Gray covered in coal. This is meant to make the player worry about what our hero is actually reading into it, that we just can't see. But nothing in Chapter 4 reads quite like insanity like the empty room. The mood here is different, like we just stepped into a state of timelessness. And our character seems to feel a connection to the room, like they belonged here. No matter how on board the player is with the state of mind of the character they are playing, the empty room ultimately leads our hero to face off with their own personal trauma.
In the war photo level, we have these very high trench walls going. We did this because of 2 reasons. The first would be it's a stylized choice. We wanted to give the player a feel of claustrophobia. Secondly, we wanted to avoid let the player see too much of the above ground. If you get up close to the mound beast, you can see his head is actually really cool. It doesn't have any eyes, and it kind of resembles how a bat looks.
It's so cool to see that Emily has her own adventure in this version. That's something I wanted to do in the first version, but we didn't have time. The story is exactly the same with Emily, and in this one, you can really enjoy another point of view of the story.
I'm also very happy that we managed to really differentiate the 2 stories. I'm a big fan of playing and replaying a game, especially when there's multiple perspectives or just different characters. One part I really like when coming up with places in stories is just to consider their backstory. If Derceto is the countryside asylum now, what was it during the Spanish flu pandemic, or during the Civil War, or even before that? With Emily's story, I got to weave her backstory in a little with the emergency hospital that Derceto was in the late 1910s. While we are close to the climax to rediscovering that story, you can see traces of it before. Both Baptiste and Lottie recognizes Emily and even calls her by her husband-to-be's name. The 2 trauma portions of the story I really enjoy. I kind of wish we could have done more with that.
I like your choice for the main characters because he plays a detective in Stranger Things. So for an adventure game, it's very, very cool to feel that you are a detective too and investigate mysteries.
Well, every case can't be squeaky clean.
We have a lot of paintings in the Derceto and in other worlds. To make this happen and to make it look as good and real as possible, we decided to use public domain paintings by real painters. Few of the objects in the game is actually scanned objects from museums and libraries that we can use, and we build a low poly version of it, and we can bake the textures directly from the scanned models.
The city of New Orleans has always been a part of our design, but its usage and scale has changed due to technical limitation and in turn design decisions. Here we are in the clearest reference that still exists to the actual city, a park-like square with a looming cathedral. That place is of course Jackson Square and the St. Louis Cathedral.
Pearl River. This is where I caught up with them. This is what the Dark Man wanted me to revisit. But I'm still not seeing it. What am I forgetting?
The bridge over Pearl River is an interesting level to me. It came about when first reading up on New Orleans and the surrounding area. I happened upon this old photo, this bridge with its very mechanical design that seemed to have just been dropped into this wild bayou. It just seemed beautifully melancholic, and I'm really glad we managed to translate that whole scene into the game.
For the Pearl River Bridge, we wanted to do a very sad and melancholy mood to go hand in hand with how the story progresses. To do this, we chose to go with a very earthly and yellow color palette, as well as having very calming and not too heavy animations or wind or anything like that.
Yeah, this kind of static camera in the game reminds me a lot the original one, but actually I hated it because when the character face a room, a new room, from the player point of view, you cannot see inside the room, so you are scared to walk in, but actually the character in the game can see inside the room, and it disturbed me a lot during the whole dev of the game.
The fixed camera angle in the rooms we called Gray's apartment is of course a direct reference to not just the story or the setting of the original, but the actual style of that game. When we first started developing our game, there was a brief discussion on making the whole game like this, but we decided against it because it felt limiting in so many ways. But I personally think it has a lot of charm, and a fixed camera has a lot going for it. I like how it frames things that are important to the player. Since Chapter 4 is about making the player feel that their character might be going crazy, it felt like a fun way to show this as well. Jumping from the shoulder camera to this much more observing view, we get a sense of an out-of-body experience. So while it's certainly a fun nod to the original, it also fit the experience we wanted to convey.
These three rooms are more directly referenced to the original game. The master bedroom, dressing room and the study. They go more into the original game's New England / colonial kind of style. So you have the bed with the canopy and the dresser and all these kind of small details that goes into it. To shift the mood somewhat and make the player not know if they are in the real world or not, we added the different mood in these three rooms.
The Arctic level is the second and last extreme otherworld, which kind of bookends the madness, where we start in the desert, the warm desert, and ending in the cold Arctic. And the warm desert, of course, is being the lion's nest, so to speak, for the Darkman. And the cold Arctic is therefore the opposite. It's a world dreamed into existence by Jeremy to protect his own manic personality. And in charge of this protection is Jacob van Ostad, who we find and fight on top of a cliff. I could go on about how the last layer of hell in Dante's Inferno is a cold wasteland, but that was an afterthought. It really was a lot less complicated than that. It was just a text in the original called The Unfinished Chapter of Terra Incognita by Jacob van Ostad, which conjured this vision of an Arctic landscape, and that really fitted well with our narrative, so we incorporated it.
For the observatory, which is the alien-looking structures you see here, we really try to avoid going too much into the sci-fi trope and went more towards a more ancient-looking construction. And I think we found a very nice shape language for the final observatory structure, which is this sphere you can see here, and it has the Taroea star symbols on the ground, and I think it's a really nice environment, showing off some really nice 3D art, and we have obviously the Northern Lights or Aurora Borealis, giving it some magic glow going, which is also a nice touch.
Could it be real? Or is it all just in his head?
It's a story he tells himself, Mr. Carnby. Anything to avoid the truth.